Good afternoon. This is Jane Clark Lindell, Eugene T. Moore Professor of Educational Leadership at Clemson University, with the UCEA webinar series. Today's discussion has critical implications for disseminating UCEA membership research to broader audiences, particularly policymakers. We are discussing the art of writing a policy brief and outlining in detail the critical components every policy brief should contain. To amplify the voice of UCA members in education policy discussions, we've got to use the best practices for communicating with policymakers. Joining us today are individuals with detailed experience in forming state policy and communicating with policymakers. In addition to myself, we are going to hear from Ed Fuller, who is UCEA's Associate Director for Policy and an Associate Professor of Ed Leadership at Pennsylvania State University. And our main presenter today, and we're thrilled to have her, is Kelly Latterman. Kelly is a policy specialist with the National Conference of State Legislatures, and we really appreciate what a support they've been to many of the UCA policy initiatives. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's always great to be with UCEA.
We want to extend a warm welcome to all of the policy fellows and policy associates who have joined us on this webinar. Thank you for your support for UCA's policy initiatives. For those who may be unaware, UCA's policy fellows and policy associates are teams of doctoral students, postdocs, and faculty who have taken the lead in the creation of policy briefs and reviewing the ESSA state plans, looking in particular for ways that educator and educator leaders are supported in these plans, using the best research background that would be supporting how Title II and Title I initiatives can really build capacity for schools and especially for our students. So on behalf of UCA, a warm welcome to everyone joining us today. I'd like to just take a moment to talk about protocols. We want to encourage an interactive discussion during this webinar. So if you have questions or general comments, ideas or challenges about communicating with policymakers, please type in your thoughts into the chat box or the question box on the GoToWebinar platform. We'll be monitoring these questions throughout the webinar and try to get you an answer more or less in real time with what you're seeing on the screen. So let's kick off the webinar with Ms. Lattimore and ask her to share some of her key advice for communicating with policymakers. Kelly, the floor is yours.
Thank you for having me. And I just want to confirm too that you're able to see right now my screen, is that correct?
Yes, I can see it.
Wonderful. Okay, great. So in terms of the presentation roadmap here, NCSL as an organization we'll speak about quickly, just to provide some context. Then next, the national landscape of state legislatures, moving on how to convey complex information to busy readers, and then establishing yourself as a key and unique source as well as your institution. Lastly, then protecting your and your agency's integrity. The catalyst for this webinar came through, I was speaking with Michelle and Marcy and others after meeting many of you in Detroit at the convention last year, and I'm happy to be providing some context on specifically writing these policy briefs. And then I look forward to reading those briefs and continuing this conversation later this fall in Denver, which is where I'm located at your air, or certainly sooner. So as Janie gave a fabulous introduction, and had mentioned, if there are any questions you have, please feel free to ask them throughout, and Janie will be passing those along to me. So I'll be able to stop and pause and explain on any of these slides. NCSL is a membership organization that began in 1975. We work with all 50 state legislatures and the territories, and we are bipartisan in all that we do. There are 7,383 state legislators, and then an additional 30,000 legislative staff. So quite a few policymakers and then staff out there. It's our mission to work with these, both state legislators and staff, to improve the quality and effectiveness of the state legislatures and to promote policy innovation and communication among the state legislatures. We provide nonpartisan research and analysis, and we link legislators with each other and with experts. In this case, that's going to be you all. We also have the opportunity to speak on behalf of the legislatures in DC, making sure that there's no federal overreach and that the state legislators have a voice at the table. In terms of why you should care about state legislators, they are forming opinions and voting on legislation that will affect schools and students every year. That includes developing and overseeing and funding a wide variety of programs that are affecting school principals specifically. So even during times when other policy issues are taking precedence, the legislators continue to take action on issues that are affecting you. Because of the variety and complexity of the policy issues before them, they often rely on their staff, on researchers, experts in the field, lobbyists, practitioners, and community members to gather information and develop policies that address a need or respond to an opportunity. In this case, new federal funds and guidance through the Every Student Succeeds Act. Legislators have access to research through legislative staff or research organizations, just like MCSL, but they rely heavily on experts in the field. So that's people like you all who are able to provide that information and firsthand perspective on the effects of laws and public funding on school leadership. So just a quick overview right now on state legislatures nationwide. Currently, there are 32 states, chambers controlled by the Republicans, 14 Democrats, 3 are split, and then 1 is unicameral, and that is Nebraska. They are vastly different state to state. There's variations in the number of members and staff, the amount of time spent in session, and the legislative procedure and political makeup. But despite these differences, the legislative process in general is very similar across the states. So there are 3 things I just wanted to point out quickly before I provide that context for you on writing specifically. It's important to understand the legislature so you understand the audience you're writing for. The first is term limits. The second is the size of the legislatures and the staff themselves. And then the last is the full versus part-time legislature. So on term limits, there are 15 states nationwide that have term limits. Those are listed on the screen in front of you. About 20% of legislators every year are new in their elections, and then you have the addition of the term limits. So with these 2 pieces, the new elections, the new legislators, and then the term limits, you have a decrease in institutional memory and deep policy knowledge. So every year, you have the opportunity to be providing new educational opportunities for sharing information on a wide variety of policy topics. When you are speaking with legislators, you want to know about the term limits in that state as they're influencing the amount of institutional knowledge present in that legislature. So you want to make sure you're aware of that experience level before you're targeting the legislators you're speaking to. The next is the full-time versus part-time legislature. So in states with short sessions, the legislators are often heavily scheduled. Beyond the official beginning and the end dates, you want to be aware of whether the relevant state expects legislators to work outside of session, whether official legislative functions occur outside of session, and then some legislators are in committee meetings outside of session, some are not. The average legislative session is 120 calendar days. That's one of those examples is Colorado. And then the shorter legislative sessions, Wyoming as an example, they're meeting only 40 days in odd years and then 20 days in even years. In California, Illinois, Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, others listed there on the screen, they have that longer legislative session going year round. So something to think about, much like teachers who have the summer off and principals, but not really, legislators are often the same way. So even though they're not physically in session, they still have a ton of work to do outside. But it's just important to note, when you want to be speaking with a legislator, when you're looking at policy making in your state, are they an organization that is full-time, part-time, that type of thing. The last thing to note here is just a quick overview on staff size. You can see vastly different staff size here. In California, over 2,000 legislative staff. Then in Wyoming, just around 100. So if the staff were split evenly, each legislator in California would have 17. And then in Wyoming, you would have about 1.5 staff members. So when you are interacting with staff, you want to be aware of the hierarchy of those staff members you're interacting with, and then also just how many of them are there. Now, understanding the state legislature in general, it's important to understand that process and the players in your own legislature. So I encourage you, feel free to look online at NCSL. We maintain a clearinghouse of the state legislature's websites. You can also choose whichever search engine of your choice and do a little research, but just to know who is your state representative and your senator, where do they stand on your issues, who are the legislative leaders in your state, what is the party makeup, what's the legislative calendar look like, and then what's the process for public input during committee hearings, and how do you get information to them. And once you know how to get information to them, you need to know what type of information to give to them. So in terms of getting to know the legislature, you want to be able to contribute that information to the legislative process, and you need to understand the constraints that affect how the legislators are able to respond to public policy issues or proposals. And though there are many different constraints, the fact that they might not have a lot of staff to help, or they might not be in session all the time, the good news is that most legislators see themselves as students. So if you think back on that earlier slide, the green states and even those hybrid states, the legislative staff can be the easiest conduit into a legislator's schedule and priority list. And once you build that relationship, which you'll hear from Ed Fuller and from others at a later time, but a lot of professors have done this. They've built a relationship with key legislators in their states. They're proactive in providing information rather than reactive. And once they've established themselves and their agency, their institution as a key resource, then they often have legislative staff or legislators actually reaching out to them for that information. But before you can be reached out to, you need to make sure that they know you're there and you have great information to give. So in terms of providing that great information, strategies for effective communication with that legislative audience. Your writing should always assume a non-expert audience. And what I mean by that is, for experts, the material has already been learned. The retrieval takes very little effort, and the thinking is at a pretty sophisticated level. But for non-experts, they're acquiring new information, their attention is used learning the facts, and their thinking is generally at a basic level. Legislators must monitor many different issues simultaneously. The specialist versus the generalist. We function as specialists, but they must be generalists. They need to understand everything around them, regardless of what committees they serve on. They're voting on every bill. So you want to make sure you're packaging that information as effectively as possible. What you need to remember there is to be concise, to make sure you're prepared, you're relevant, and that you're providing accurate data and objective analysis. And that piece, the objective analysis, is key, as once they kind of see a bias in the writing, they're thinking of it in a certain box. What's great and helpful is if you can provide context and data that is not necessarily supporting one side, but rather just stating the facts. When you're writing these briefs, you need to think about what issue or topic you're writing about. The content of your writing product has 3 moving parts. The first is that question, the question that the readers might have about the issue or the topic. The next is the answers that you're providing to those questions. And then the third piece is the data that supports the answers. In this, you sometimes think of the data coming through in public opinions or pros or cons, a specific bill or memo, but regardless, the formats of a brief are to be brief. And I really stress the brief piece. I want to share just a few quotes on information overload in their own words. So from two former Colorado representatives, the first says, going through all the information we have here is kind of like drinking from a fire hydrant. The next, a North Dakota senator says, I don't need to know how to make the watch, I just need to know what time it is. And then the last, a former Colorado senator writes, my seatmate told me this was a bad bill. I was planning on voting no until I realized it was my own bill. So when you're thinking about all of the information they're receiving all the time, it's helpful to provide just quick, simple, effective ways for them to understand the information. And on that, just some specific strategies for effective communication here. The first is that shorter is usually better. If you can put it into one page, put it into one page. The next is avoiding jargon and these acronyms. The alphabet soup can become a bit overwhelming. Just on this call alone, we have UCEA, we have NCSL, then shortened version of all of the universities. So making sure you just define the terms because not everybody knows what those are. And the next is providing the explanations of these unknown names in the organizations, that you're providing the legislators the basics. What do they need? What do they want? That's what you're providing. On accurate data and objective analysis, how about a chart? So providing any type of illustration. And then last is this a bite, a snack, and a meal approach. And what that really means is, one, the bite, just giving them a little tidbit of this information. Why does it matter to them? The snack might be providing a paragraph, a few key bullets of information. And then the meal in this case is not a feast, but just a meal, and that's the brief. And what you want to do there is give them ideally no more than 2 pages of information. The last thing to note is this busy reader, earnest writer conflict. And what I mean by this is that there is an ongoing conflict between these two pieces. The reader needs brevity, they need those main points first, then the explanation. They want to be able to skim the information, they're interested in anecdotes that are illustrating the major issue. Whereas you as the earnest writer likely want to provide accuracy and completeness, that's your priority. You want to do the parts first, then the point, item by item, providing a lot of data. And this is all wonderful, both sides wonderful, but because you're writing specifically for this legislative audience, the focus really needs to be on this busy reader aspect. And if they need more information, they will always follow up. The illustration on the right here, this Legis brief, it's an NCSL piece, and though you can't see the details there, the point is just to provide that in this setting you see we're using headings and bullet points, that there's a summary paragraph at the beginning of the memo, we're using these short brief sentences, and that there's an illustration there. Other ways to help your reader include providing a chunking of information, so asking how can the reader learn best from this written document, and how can I organize a document to best be absorbed by the reader, and then blocking those things together in short paragraphs. You want to make sure that the first and last sentence in the paragraph are both very strong, and when you are using those citations, and I know this is something Marcy had noted that you all are huge fans of, which is just fabulous, but those should be footnotes or endnotes, and they should never be in the text. So you want those to be at the end of the document ideally, and if you are sending your document electronically, then hyperlinks can be very helpful on that. So where should you put all that helpful background information? Well, it is important to include and to know in your writing, acknowledging any previous legislation on the topic. It's useful to note what policymakers can actually do with the information. So when you're saying this issue perhaps has been in a hearing recently, you want to find out what type of background materials exist on the subject and what the legislators have already heard, and then make sure you're providing information about what to do next, or beyond this background information, how the subject has evolved. So since the previous legislation in 2007, what has been happening in principal preparation in Arkansas, etc. Other states' national relevant legislation, and any task forces or standing committees that may have occurred in the state you're working with, or a state that might be a nearby neighbor and could be someone they may want to learn from. So when you're ending that brief, you want to make sure you've pointed out the action steps. Specifically, what does the legislator or their caucus need to do with the information you have provided? Are there intended or unintended consequences? And these could be social or physical consequences. Does the information affect the problem in a positive or a negative way? You're providing new information. What does it do? What does this do to create the effect, and what is likely to happen as a result of the information? You want to point out those possible effects, and specifically, in just a moment, I'm going to share one of these impact examples of an effect of sharing information. But as a reminder, just want to encourage everyone, when you're going into this writing, know that it's something different. And though you've been writing for years, the specific type of writing is really difficult because it's something you are incredibly passionate about and a technical expert in. But good writers can go haywire, and adult brains can work against us in these situations, as we might be providing too much information or going too far into the weeds. So providing this impact example, and this is one I've shared with UCEA a few times before, but I think I have a new audience of UCEA members in front of me today. The reason this is my favorite is because it was the real life impact of one individual principal who, what had happened was in the state of Maine, Senator Brian Langley, who was the co-chair of the Education Committee, accepted an invitation to visit a doctoral educational leadership classroom at the University of Maine. He accepted that proposal and went to the classroom where he heard from current students, and they were providing little policy pitches on things that could change in the state of Maine to make the life of school principals easier. And Senator Langley was inspired by this discussion. He decided he wanted to make changes and reached out to one of these individual students who had made a big impact on him and encouraged him to provide written testimony so that he could get this task force on school leadership passed. So one of the doctoral students and a high school principal, this was a gentleman named Chris Record, submitted written testimony on the challenges he and his classmates were struggling with. What happened was the bill passed and a task force on school leadership was formed in the state of Maine. The group met and I was able to speak with them, and together with the Maine Principals Association, we set up something called A Day in the Life, Legislators Learning with Principals. So we paired all of the legislators with principals in the state, and they shadowed them for a day. We gave them a set of questions to talk about and gave them some policy pieces for them to look at specifically. And out of that came just fantastic feedback from the legislators, who so appreciated hearing directly from those principals and then the superintendents in some cases that they were able to speak to. And I had wanted to share this quote with you all from Representative Michael McKellen, which was, "This was a great start. I'm now seeing the results of the ideas of the last few sessions in action. Legislators sitting in principals' shoes for a day gave me more insight on how my votes impact the life of schools. The reality is I would now do some things differently." So there's great impact to be made by speaking to legislators and by sharing policy briefs with them, but establishing that relationship, really. And that's what I wanted to get across, is that, of course, this webinar was on writing effective policy briefs, but part of that is being able to effectively communicate with legislators, often in person or in some case virtually. So in getting that information across to them, it's most effective when you've already established that relationship. And when you have begun to establish that relationship, one thing to remember is that you're representing more than yourself. You are, throughout the course of your interactions with state legislators, speaking for institutions that you're associated with. So in addition to speaking with them and representing yourself and the organizations you're affiliated with, you're really tasked with protecting the integrity of those institutions you're speaking for, and then, of course, respecting the integrity of the legislature itself. And I say that because people speak, and perhaps you're speaking for, in my case, I'm currently with the University of Colorado, Denver. So, perhaps I'm speaking with them, but all of these other institutions I'm affiliated with are also connected to me. So I wanted to share this little slide here and just one anecdote before I close and we speak further about this as a group. And that is that I recently walked into a legislative meeting with a representative in Pennsylvania that I had not met before. I happened to have gone to high school in his district and had mentioned that in my initial request for a meeting. It's always useful to share any connection you might have up front, as legislators are busy, and that will, of course, pique their interest. Well, he took my meeting and then ran with that one line I had provided in the email. And when I went in for that meeting, he asked me about a scholarship program that I had participated in as a junior in high school. I was so thrown off that it took me a few seconds to even catch up on what he was referring to. So just as we prep for meetings with policymakers, the policymakers themselves like to know who they're speaking with. So when you are speaking with those elected officials, you're representing your institutions and affiliated organizations, even those that you assume they're not aware of because they might have nothing to do with the specific topic you are discussing. And I want to note this as applicable to your use of social media as well. I was just having a conversation about this with Professor Ed Fuller the other day, and we were teasing and saying, my Twitter, which if you'd like to continue the conversation, I'm at Kelly Latterman, but my Twitter is perhaps a bit boring because I don't share much in terms of the ways of opinions or anything partisan, and a big part of that is because of my role with the National Conference of State Legislatures, which is a bipartisan organization. And, Ed doesn't necessarily have that because he's associated with PSU and it's a different piece in terms of the partisanship. But what we were talking about is how it's great to engage online, and I'm often reading and I'm just not necessarily retweeting, so I'm a bit of a ghost. I'm sure some can relate. But my point there is that whenever you're speaking with these policymakers, you're representing more than yourself. So just to keep that in mind as well. And with that, I cannot wait to read these briefs. I'm happy to go into as much detail as possible with any of you who might have additional questions. So I will turn it back to Janie, and if there are questions for me or comments, I'd love to hear them.
Well, thank you, Kelly. I think what you've provided us is a really exciting overview of how to think through those state level contacts. And there were a couple of things that you mentioned that I kind of like to follow up on, just because I'm not seeing a whole lot of questions popping up here. But one of the ideas that I was wondering that you triggered when you talked about term limits affecting both policy knowledge and policymaking capacity in the states, it just kind of led me to a couple of questions that I wonder if NCSL might have some information about. So one of the things that I do think is affecting just about every kind of occupation, not just state legislators or education, is the age of the boomer generation, and the fact that even though some people look at being a state representative or state senator as a kind of at my second career, it still says something about the rate of turnover of legislators as well. So does NCSL kind of keep track of the age of legislators in the various states?
We do, and I'm thinking quickly on my feet here on the most recent look. I'm vaguely thinking it's around 60, and I wish I had that direct information in front of me, so I will take a look at that. But in general, on the average age and average occupation of legislators and everything else of that nature, What's interesting to note is that many of them are retired, and this is sort of their after career piece. So if we think about, on average, sort of the stereotype of the legislators, most are male, most are white, most are college educated. That's all my recollection there. But many of them are not necessarily coming from business backgrounds or might not be lawyers or something of that nature. There's a wide variety of legislators. It depends on the state. Certain states and certain legislatures, that are in session year round attract a different type of member. But the lawmakers, and I'm just looking now, the average age is 56, so I was 4 years off, but 56 is the average age of state legislators, and then the average age in the U.S. now is 47. So a bit older than that, but still younger than Congress. But the lawmakers themselves, the average age of the members is older in these states that are full time, and then older in these states that are part time, as it's often an after career piece, and it just depends on the state. So lots of variety, but it's a good point to bring up. Lots of variety in the state legislators. And even though most of them kind of have this same core set of attributes, that's not necessarily true across the board. There's a lot of diversity when you really dig deeper.
Okay, so the other point of diversity you kind of alluded to that makes me wonder and think about the legislative capacity that might be background in approaching them is an observation that I've just sort of made casually, and I was wondering if NCSL might have harder data than just my observation from working in 4 or 5 different states. And that is, there are states where the occupational differences are much broader than other states. So, if you were talking about my observation in a couple of states where you could run into small business, agriculture, former teachers or former superintendents, lawyers and retailers, people who have worked for large, huge companies as like regional managers, you might see some different expectations and patterns of policymaking, even capacity for policymaking, than places like you mentioned where you might find more lawyers or small business people and not very many other kinds of occupations represented. So does NCSL have kind of a sketch of what all the occupations are that might be represented?
Absolutely. So and I have been looking for this webpage, but if you look online, we have a webpage called Who Do We Elect? The Demographics of State Legislatures. And so this page talks a lot about, as I said, that average lawmaker, white Protestant baby boomer with a graduate degree. But the truth is that only 50 of all the legislators, of all the 7,000 or so, have all of those characteristics. So though they might be a little less diverse than the country in general, they do reflect a wide variety of people, and all the time there is an increase in the number of minorities and the number of women, and then the number of people with different types of jobs that are entering the legislature. So in terms of the different types of jobs, I had said many of them come from that business background, but that's 30%. 30% of the legislators in 2015 were coming from that business background. Then following that, they are an attorney. They are listing themselves as an educator in 6% of cases, and then they're coming from an agricultural background in 5% of the cases. Another 8% of legislators say they're retired, and another 8% say they are consultants. So pretty diverse representation of of occupations in that group.
So when we're thinking about the kinds of information that each state might prefer in terms of talking about outcomes for elementary and secondary students, we may want to think in terms of some of the sectors that the legislators would be more familiar with in trying to make those connections and communicate with them about expectations.
Absolutely, and that's a big piece of what I was trying to say in terms of connecting to them on things that you might have in common. So if you are someone who, you're a principal now, but you also have a great interest in, gardening as an example, perhaps you can provide some type of example that touches on a joint interest in gardening. And these legislators are ultimately there because they're interested in serving their communities, right? So if you're a constituent, then why would they not want to talk to you? Of course, they want to hear what you have to say. You guys are experts in the field, and it's very helpful for them to have this information. So if you're establishing that connection and differentiating yourself from the group by showing you have something in common, that's a great way in. And a good way to do that, just as a base level, is to make sure you look around on their website, and they always have these About Me sections where they provide those types of that type of information. You might find out even you go to the same church, or that you both have children in the same school, or something of that nature, and that's very helpful to pull on your shared experience, or certainly any professional past that you might have in similarity.
Marcy, I see you're in control of the screen again. I was wondering if you could pull up our little clip art that sort of represents the way we're thinking about our policy briefs from the University Council for Educational Administration. And
absolutely, I'm having there it is. I think Marcy has that there. Are you able to see that?
Right. So I'm referring to the little sections of funnel that's on the right hand of the screen. And we've taken pretty much sort of the bullets that were interjected into the slide that, as we were going along, that Kelly was giving us the overview on. So I think one of the things that you should view is this kind of the template and formatting, is that we really want to provide answers to the issues. That because the attention span is short, because they don't really want people coming in and telling completely all of the kind of academic background that so many university professors are known for. What we really need to do is get to the point quick. So we know they're grappling with an issue, and here's our bullet set of answers. Then that middle section is going to be a little bit longer, because that's where we're going to put in why these answers make some sense. And the part that we were talking about in terms of making connections is the kind of power that metaphorical thinking can bring. So that if you can tell an anecdote that fits with their connection, and I'll just use Kelly's note about thinking about gardening, and whether or not the person you're talking to, the legislator or staff member you're talking to, is known for their focus on the flora and the fauna of the great state of wherever you are, then one of your examples in there can be a kind of metaphorical example. And then at the end, where Kelly told you the truth, she wasn't really taking a dig at academics, she was telling you the truth. Nobody wants to see a reference list of 100 different sources. Basically, what we're really trying to do is say, if you read anything, read these one or two. But what we're really trying to do is combat, in many cases, some of the sort of anecdotal phone calls and sad stories that come with what makes something an issue. So, for example, telling tales about individual kids who've had terrible experiences with schools. We want to combat that with not just the stories of the good things that happen, but actually how did we solve those problems? It's not just having the problem identified and then, as we've seen in a lot of hearings and testimony in many state legislators over time, where you get kid after parent telling something awful that happened in the school, which then justifies changing schooling for everyone. What we need to do is tell those stories of, and then how did we work it out for a kid who had that kind of experience? Then how did we work it out for parents who are facing these kinds of challenges? So our rationale and examples need to be based on data, but we also need to be key storytellers so that we're making that connection with the legislators.
Yeah, and that's a great point, Janie. I have two things to add there. The first is that clarification on connecting with the policymakers, and what I meant by sharing an example in terms of some type of personal connection is more when you're physically there, when you're physically speaking with the legislator or legislative staff member, when you're in their office and presenting the information. And that's great because it piques their attention and makes them listen, and you're able to give a quick pitch, a quick overview, if you will, to encourage them to do the reading. This might also take the place in email with sort of a cover sheet and then an introduction in the body of email as to what the policy brief is. But in the policy brief itself, as you said, two things there. And the first is that sharing of examples. You're absolutely right that in many cases, legislators are hearing those heartstring pulling stories, and those will continue to happen. And of course, they're interested, and everybody's interested. But the data speaks, and legislators are really focused on collecting that data, getting that information, and then understanding that data. So once you're providing them with that information in those raw numbers, you need to be able to explain the context in terms of what do they need to do with this information. So rather than sharing, hearing one story and then making up a bill so that whatever the specific scenario is doesn't happen again, you can explain that this is this is the background information, that there was one individual that shared this type of story, and though that particular occurrence was a challenge, that the raw data speaks to blank. This is the raw data. These are some examples of things that are happening every day in the classroom and for our school principals, for our teachers. And if you can provide them with that information in some type of anecdotal format, but also just the data with the data analysis, that's very helpful. As I said, if they are curious about this information, want to learn more, they'll reach out to you as the author. They will follow up with you in terms of your resource list. And that's something to think about as well, is when you are citing, what you might want to consider doing is putting an additional resource link, paragraph or so, something different from the bibliography. So something that says additional resources, or for additional information, look at these 3 to 5 websites or 3 to 5 journals, rather than these are the 50 journals that I cited from. So something else to take into consideration.
One of the important points to bring from UCA's perspective is that not only are we really trying to promote the importance of leadership development and how great leaders provide great schools for kids and good outcomes in the long run for a state or a community, is the recognition that not only can we make recommendations based on research, but we also need to pay attention to and respond to trends that may occur because, different parties pay attention to different sources in terms of trying to figure out a universal remedy that might work from state to state. And I think that that's one of the important aspects that we need to think about is in terms of our policy brief development, we're in a better situation in terms of being able to have the ready data going for us. But we need to be just as ready for some of the activities that show up that's a little bit unexpected and yet seems to be a trend from state to state. So we need to be alert to trends, but we also need to not lose sight of them at the same time that we're working on some of the really big issues that our own research shows.
Absolutely true. It's great to point out those trends. It's something we try and do regularly for legislators because something might be of great interest in one state, but not in particular in another. And then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, you see 5 states that are picking up an issue. And even just looking at current events and being aware of things that might affect you down the line. Thinking of one example, and this is in my head just because I was writing something and I'll probably do a blog in the next week or so, but on higher education and freedom of speech. So you have all likely seen many news stories about that happening right now with professors and students and some arguments breaking out and freedom of speech. And the reality is that this was an issue that's kind of always been in the back of people's minds, but maybe wasn't getting as much action in terms of media coverage and legislative response. But seemingly out of nowhere, you have this popping up in the news, and in turn, policymakers are responding to that, and it's something that they are aware of, that their constituents are concerned about, and so that's something they're looking for information about, trying to learn more from other states and figuring out, where they went, what did they do to combat this potential challenge in their own states, and to go from there. So if you're thinking forward, if you're at the forefront and you're realizing this is going to be an issue, I should start learning about this, finding out how it could affect me, and make sure I put that information in an easy to understand format so I can share that information with my policymakers. Ultimately, they want to hear from their constituents. And though we talk about information overload, if it's quick, if it's concise, and if it's relevant, then that is incredibly helpful.
Kelly, how does NCSL pick up on these sort of trending things? Do you have a special website like some of the other places you recommended?
We do have hot topics pages for many of our topics. I have a hot topics page I maintain on school leadership, so that might be useful to you all. But in terms of kind of how to spot a trend, for us, it's a combination of factors. For us, if we're seeing something in the news, it's something that's always in the back of my mind, and I'm looking out and trying to find more information. But a trend for me is really when 3 or more states pick up on a topic and propose legislation on that topic. I also will often have insight on this because legislators and legislative staff are constantly reaching out to us directly as policy specialists in these issues and asking us what we know about the topic, what other states have done, and who we can connect them to. And what's great is when I know that there's someone I can connect them to who's an expert in this topic, I am able to connect them directly. And to provide, yet another example with Ed, you can tell I'm working with him all the time, but he's just so helpful. I had reached out to him last week about some rural school choice, so specifically the roles of online charters, because that was something that a lot of legislators had been talking about and something that I was going to speak to them about, and I wanted to get the best people on that, and he was able to give me a list of some researchers that I'll be reaching out to this week, and quite a few of them are actually UCA members, and for all I know, one of them is on this webinar right now. So, sometimes we come directly to you, which is incredibly helpful. But yeah, just providing that information, making sure when you are writing a brief or putting together a blog or,
well, Kelly,
graphic.
I'm interested because we have a related question, and I'm going to toss this because Professor Ed Fuller has joined us. So Ed, when you are dealing with a particular issue or topic, how do you make it important to legislators, especially since they may be reacting to a lot of trending things and a bunch of issues being pushed by their own constituents?
Well, part of the issue is knowing what your legislators are interested in. Some are all about achievement, so you need to connect it to achievement. Some are about finances, so can you say that it's going to save money? It helps to know what they're most interested in. Almost all of them are interested in achievement, so that's kind of a no-brainer. But their interests differ, so knowing your audience well is really helpful. And that again comes through relationships and in watching the news and seeing what they're putting out and knowing those are some strategies where you can get to know what they want to know outside of directly contacting them, which of course is the best way. But sometimes that's not possible, especially for grad students. It might not be the first avenue they choose. But looking at what their policy issues are, what their website says, you can get a pretty good sense of what they're most interested in, and then try to address that.
Kelly, do you have a follow-up answer for how to kind of cold call a legislator if you've got a topic that might not have really surfaced yet?
Yeah, I mean, Ed is absolutely right. So certainly do everything Ed said is number one. But but two is just making sure that when you're introducing yourself, as I stated previously, you want to make sure if you have any personal connection to them whatsoever, you have an aunt and uncle who lives in the district, you volunteer in their district, make sure you share that information. And that's a great way to just get in the door. But just to tell them this is something that's been in the news. This is something that could be connected to you, and I wanted to make sure you were aware of it. And that's helpful. I mean, oftentimes when you're connecting, you're trying to connect with a legislator, you aren't able to necessarily talk to them directly because they are busy. They're not necessarily picking up their phone. They have these legislative staff members who are the next best thing, and sometimes even better, because they're the ones that are really understanding the issues. So, taking your time with the legislative staff, being kind and respectful and professional, and just talking with them about this information as well can get you very far. And what that can do too is next time the legislator is thinking about a topic, or when your topic does come to the front of their mind, that legislative staff is in the room and is able to say, oh, I actually have a constituent, or I spoke to someone recently who is an expert on this topic. Let me send them an email and follow up with them. And when you can have that going, you're in a great place.
I think one of the other things that I hope we can really press on is when you're thinking about these sort of cold calls and people press back, I just want to point out as an example, in South Carolina, we now have CPR and AEDs in schools, but it took 5 years of a particular group of people constantly going up and never being discouraged about the fact that they could get appointments, but they couldn't get the bill to go any further. So I do think persistence is one of the really important things. I have another question that just pertains to kind of the wrap up that we're really thinking about in terms of UCEA. Most of what we're working on, this question asks, is for these briefs, are we writing for states or federal policymakers or both? One of the reasons that Policy Fellows and the Policy Associates was formulated is because although UCA and other organizations that we've affiliated with, like NCSL, do have a national presence, when it comes to education legislation, the actions at the state level. In particular, the shift has been really apparent with the passage of the Every Student Succeeds Act, is that there's definitely an intention that's being redrawn at the state level And a huge question that's still kind of out there about what exactly the federal role in state level education policy might be. And as a result of that, we formed the Policy Associates and the Policy Fellows group because we really saw more distributed action out in the states for this period of time. So in a way, that's an indirect answer. It's kind of both, but the reality is if you're going to do anything about school leadership, nearly every state has its own law. And because of that, a lot of our actions and a lot of our policy topics are going to be about states and accommodating different states, not just sort of a big 30,000 feet federal view. Ed, do you want to add to that a little bit in terms of who our audiences are in Policy Fellows and Policy Associates?
I'm sorry, I had a little trouble hearing you. Could you ask that again? I'm hearing some scratching from somebody.
Oh, okay. Well, the Policy Fellows and Policy Associates, primarily the briefs audiences is what the question's about. Or is it primarily state or federal?
Probably. That's a tough one. I would probably say both at this point, but if you can get data or something that ties it directly to a state, then you could spin it off and do it directly to a state. I think the first round will be more at the federal level. But certainly, I mean, we UCA members take the ones we do that we've taken to Congress and then take them to their state legislatures, and that's perfectly fine. It just makes it, and I know Kelly's talked about this, is if you can include data specific or information specific to a state, it makes it a whole lot more relevant to the legislator that you're meeting with, or more likely the staffer than if you take something more generic. And I think most of ours are going to be more generic. So I mean, you could use them at both levels.
I'm going to have to wrap this up because we're really close to the end of today's webinar. And I think the fact that we have differing opinions on this last question shows that we
which is fine.
Really continue this conversation further. So I would like to thank Kelly Latterman and Ed Fuller for joining us today, sharing your information, and remind everybody that a full recording of this discussion is going to be available at www.uca.org. And we encourage you not only to look at it, but to share with other people you think might be interested. So I want to say thank you again. I think both Ed and Kelly have helped us think further about communicating with our policymakers, particularly at the state level. Goodbye, everybody, and have a great week.
Thank you.